I did want to take it from the campus to the street. When I recently visited the Nova exhibit.
Yeah.
And then literally that day, an hour later, the whole place erupted in a protest led by really, really despicable people protesting a commemorative exhibit about people who were massacred.
Yeah.
So
and raped.
Yeah. And
but they think that part's a hoax.
Yeah. No, either they say it didn't happen or they're glad it did happen. So I'm just like, pick one. They're saying it. They're saying it's propaganda, used an atrocity propaganda. This is Zionist propaganda, and yet resistance by any means necessary. So talk about holding contradictory ideas in your head. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Marcuse. But I guess the limits of free speech. I know you've been asked this a lot, and I always. This conversation about which phrasing constitutes a threat. You can't threaten individuals, public versus private space. If you could speak a little to where you draw these distinctions as, I guess, a free speech absolutist, if you consider yourself one, in what sense can we have this conversation now that we could talk about free speech all day long in a context 10 years ago when we want to just have ideas that are freely discussed on campus. But now when we're talking about violence or support of terrorism, safety, senses of safety being violated for students, like where does free speech come into play?
Well, to be clear, 10 years ago, all these issues were still around. They just weren't quite as intense.
Maybe 20 years ago. I mean,
20 years ago, they were around too. You always have to remind people like how much darker the past actually is than they remember.
Sure. Fair enough.
I think about the Oklahoma City bombing, for example, like one of those things that's kind of like, there was a domestic terrorism. It was terrifying.
But were there protests on campus supporting Oklahoma City?
that is a good point. Not to my knowledge.
What was his name? McKay?
Timothy
McVeigh. He was a resistance fighter. Timothy McVeigh was supporting resistance against whatever, Osama bin Laden, I'm sure, felt like he was supporting a resistance movement too.
There were, and 9/11, there were absolutely people on campus who said he's totally right. We totally had it coming. And because I started right around 9/11, believe me, there were a lot of students and professors.
So maybe there's the beginning of it. This sort of
and the reason why they weren't going McVeigh was right was because McVeigh was a right wing terrorist. But when they perceived of the 9/11 attackers as being freedom fighters, there was a lot of people saying, "Oh, these guys are right," including many people that Fire defended. Right. So, what are the parameters? Like, what is protected and what isn't? First of all, there's no such thing as a free speech absolutist, at least not among like any serious person. I am an opinion absolutist. That essentially whatever opinion you have is worth knowing. And here's the thing that really gets missed here. If you are shouting out that I am a horrible anti-Semite who believes that nobody was, raped in the October 7th attacks, it is good information to have about that. It is good to know that people actually think that. You are not safer for being like, if we are magically to shut up like all of these activists tomorrow, you would be less safe for not knowing like how serious this movement has become. Mm-hmm. So, and this is the way I put it, is that, if the project of human knowledge is to know the world as it is, it's literally impossible to know the world as it is without knowing what people really think. And that's not true even if it's bad. It's true especially if it's concerning, especially if it's something that's dangerous. And that's one of the reasons why I think Europe has this kind of is more of a powder keg than people really quite get, is that they do rely on censorship to kind of keep social peace, and that's not gonna work over time. But anyway, so I think the First Amendment does a really good job of actually having sensible exceptions to freedom of speech that are cabined to narrow categories, so it can't turn into this balancing test thing that Europe does, for example, or that some of the thinkers on the left, like Stanley Fish, want us to do. That essentially we should just be, every time there's offensive speech, we go kind of like, well, on this hand, and guess what happens when you have a balancing test? Power always justifies its own way. So having the categorical approach is smart. So threats aren't protected. Like something that would actually make a reasonable person think that they are in fear of bodily harm or death are not protected, nor should they be. Discriminatory harassment is not protected, and that's severe, persistent, and pervasive discrimination against a person or group on the basis of a protected characteristic. Definitely, I've seen that thrown around like crazy on campus for stuff that is clearly just mildly offensive speech. But definitely in the last 6 months, I've seen incidences where it's like, no, that if that Jewish student wants to say they were harassed, they were totally freaking harassed. They're also threatened. I've seen a lot of assault going on a lot of these things.
But is this against in terms of the language? Just to clarify, is it against individuals, or are we talking about even groups? If someone wants to say the Jews or this person when you're making a threat.
If you're saying it has to be against either, like, it has to be against real people. It can't just be like, in my opinion, all these people should be killed. Yeah. Like it or not, that's protected speech. But again, also useful information to know that this person thinks you should all be killed. And that's one of the things that I thought was so short-sighted of the during the anti-Semitism hearings back in December, of going after the idea of like calls for genocide, as if that was going to protect Jewish students on campus, saying that, but you must draw the line at calls for genocide. I'm like, okay, rocket scientist, do you know how quick this is going to be co-opted by the side you think you're against? And it has been completely co-opted, because what's the argument from the pro-Palestinians? Is that Israel is committing a genocide? And so it's very predictable, like the way these things, like the tool that you think is actually going to help you when it comes to censorship, when it comes to control of speech, ends up getting used against you 9 times out of 10.
Right, but I will say, I think in the case of the hearings, one of the motivations was pointing out what's actually happening on campus. Yeah. Like, are these calls happening? Not what to do about it, and if they are, if you're not doing anything about it, then you're incredible hypocrites for having one standard for other races and not another standard for Jews. And I think that was helpful to know too, right?
The double standards are off the charts. And as far as like the thing that gave me no sympathy for the university presidents who showed up that day, maybe a little bit for the MIT president, because MIT just has not been as bad as Penn or Harvard. And just to give you an impression of
they
how
just want to build stuff. Yeah,
Penn and Harvard are. We do a annual ranking of schools according to their commitment to freedom of speech. It's the largest survey of opinion ever done. Of the environment for free speech on given campuses. We also have the largest database of professor cancellations, student cancellations, deplatforming, and speech codes ever put together. We triangulate them all. We weigh them to different degrees that we've been perfecting over the years. And Harvard finished dead last.
Wow.
Earlier this year. Penn finished second to last.
Wow.
Harvard actually got a negative score, the first negative score we've ever had in our history, because they had so few pluses and so many minuses. They actually
Where's Columbia?
What's that?
Where's Columbia on that list? I feel like
Columbia does not do well, and I have a feeling they're going to do even worse this year. But Penn and Harvard dead last.
Yeah.
And so when they showed up on that hearing, it was already kind of too late, because nobody would take them seriously. And the idea that they tried to show up as if they were suddenly, unapologetic defenders of freedom of speech, even if it's highly offensive, please. And so it was a boy who cried wolf kind of situation. They weren't going to take them seriously.
Yeah.
What was it like for you to watch that? Were you just like, was your blood boiling?
I thought I didn't actually watch. I watched it in snippets. I thought they handled it really badly. I thought they got really bad advice. I thought that they should have said anti-Semitism is a problem on campus. Come out and said that. Of course, they always want to say that they so many of they want to say Islamophobia is a problem too. And it's just it's so predictable, like what they're going to say.
Right.
So I felt like, but I will say this. When they said that when it comes to what speech isn't protected, they were right saying that context matters, because there's and you don't want it to be the case that any statement, even if you say it and you're kidding, even if you say it, flippantly, even if you just write it on a piece of paper, is not protected. There has to be more. It can't just be an opinion. It can't just be a statement. It can't just be a chant. And so there was a lot of people asking, so you're saying calls for genocide are unprotected, or you're saying calls for genocide are protected. I'm like, well, let's take a beat and point out what they're actually pointing to. They're pointing to Intifada, and they're pointing to from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And I think that once you get people back there, it's kind of like by themselves, you understand these are protected speech. And I definitely understand that Jewish students, when they hear that, they hear potentially, threatening or even genocidal intentions behind them. I find it deeply offensive when people say that. But I think for a lot of these student activists, when they say intifada, they think they're saying resist. And there was a Wall Street Journal journalist who took some of the students who were chanting from the river to the sea and pointed out, here's the river, here's the sea. And they didn't even know that basically like that was the whole.
So intent matters too as to what they actually think they're saying. But you're just saying under these, assuming all these standards are applied equally, you would say all this stuff should be permitted so we know what people are thinking and expressing.
Yeah. But I did want to be clear about this one thing. Can chants of intifada with in certain contexts again, or can from the river to the sea, like when you're surrounding somebody, when you're targeting Jewish students, they all can be unprotected if there's additional actions connected to them.
Interesting.
And that's one of the things that they actually should have said as well. But they didn't know enough about freedom of speech or academic freedom to make a persuasive argument for it. They just looked flippant.
Or standing in front of students holding an Israeli flag and saying, Al-Qassam, here's your next target. Someone held a sign that said that. Now, that feels pretty direct and threatening. I don't know. But I guess it does get complicated into the weeds. Like you're saying, when things translate into action, they sort of tried to say that during the hearings, when it directly translates into action or assault or harassment. It can step it really toes the line from this is protected to this is no longer protected.